few weeks, we have been dealing with a series about God's supernatural provision in our life. And we've talked about how God has always had a ram in our thicket whenever there is a need of provision for us, that there's a storm whenever we're having a drought that makes provision for the water that we need, for the blessing. Oftentimes, when we're in the very depths of that, at the bottom of our sea, there's a blessing that's waiting for us. That even when we're caught up in bondage and in a place where we can't move, there's an earthquake for our prison to set us free. The last two things that I want to deal with today is the first of these. I want to share with you a story. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn with me to the book of John. John, the 6th chapter. And I want us to look at a situation that is going on here. Jesus was always very simple in the situations that he utilized, but he got an opportunity for those. And so Jesus is out teaching. Oftentimes, how many of you have ever been preparing to have someone come to your house that for a meal? And so your main thing was to make preparation for them, and then all of a sudden, all these little things became distractions for you. And so Jesus, his main thing was he was in order to get the truth of God's message out to the people. And one of his disciples comes up to him. Psst. Hey, Jesus, what are we going to do for all these people who've got to eat? Now, this is not a small group of people. This is not like a Saturday afternoon tea with the ladies. There were 5,000 males. And so probably most of them had a wife. And the wife, the mother, never goes anywhere without her kids, right? So when you start multiplying how many people this is actually talking about, while they said, the feeding of the 5,000, it wasn't the feeding of 5,000. It was probably more like somewhere between closer to 15,000. But the reality of it is that in the midst of that need, in the midst of what seemed a distraction, Jesus saw an opportunity to meet a need. I don't know whether any of you are like me. My wife has been working with me for 27 years. I would say she's making progress, but I still slip back into the old ways. Josiah has front row seats sometimes. End of discussion. And I am the kind of person that when I go to bed of an evening, I like to have my day for tomorrow planned out. Is there anyone else that's like that? Okay? Come on, be honest. How many of you, your day does not often go the way you plan it? And I didn't grow up in the ministry. I grew up on a farm. And I don't know what made the difference, but often our days didn't go as planned on the farm. But my wife told me with great wisdom, because she grew up, she's third generation in ministry. And she said, Steve, that's ministry. And if I'm not careful, and I'm going to be real with you guys. If I'm not cautious, this is for someone today. if I am not cautious, I can be so busy doing ministry that I miss the ministry. What is ministry? Ministry is not speaking to, people, organized crowds. Ministry is whatever the need is at the moment. That may be a phone call that you didn't anticipate. That may be walking into a grocery store and someone says, Pastor Steve. Or it may be one of your kids. For you that are parents, your greatest ministry is your family. Hands down. No questions. Because in leadership, Paul was writing to those church leaders. He's talking about elders, organized leaders of the church. He was talking about those that were called to be deacons and deaconesses. Those were the servant leaders. And he gave qualifications that you can't even be qualified to be a leader in the organized church if you don't take care of your home. If you can't handle your kids, if you're not leading your kids right, if you're not handling your finances right in your home, if you're up to the wazoo in debt, if whatever, how do you expect to lead the people of God if you're not leading your home? And so, in the midst of this, your greatest opportunity for ministry is inside your own home before you walk out the door. And if your home is in a shambles, then you need to seek God to get that fixed before you preach to the multitudes. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have everything perfect. Come on. Nobody does. But I'm talking about the general trend of your life. And in our life, we've got to have that directed. So Jesus stops teaching the multitudes, and he takes care of a need. What looked like a distraction was actually the miracle in the making. Sometimes we've got bread that's missing in our life. What is bread? Bread is anything that you have need of that you don't have. That's what bread is. When Jesus was battling Satan, Satan came to him and Jesus was hungry. Listen, you fast 40 days and see if you don't get just a twinge of hunger. And the devil came to him in his weakest place. And I'm telling you today that the devil knows your weakest place. And that's where he'll hit you every time. Paul wrote, it was Peter. Peter said, don't think it's strange when you encounter difficult situations. If you consider yourself a believer, I did a funeral day before yesterday, and there's a difference between a Christian and a believer. If you take a poll on the great United States, you'll get a lot of people who will raise their hands and say, I'm a Christian. A Christian is a title. I could call myself anything I wanted. I could call myself a brain surgeon. But just because I entitle myself in such a fashion does not mean that I walk in the skill that is necessary for that. And so call yourself a Christian all that you want to, but that doesn't mean you is one. Now, a believer, on the other hand, gets down to really where it's at. A believer says, whatever you say, God, I believe. I may not understand it. I may struggle with it. But I believe. Belief, and I can remember a time in my own life when I was down in Houston, Texas. I was at a wonderful church under a wonderful pastor, involved in wonderful ministry, and I was actually involved in the ministry there. But I was battling depression like no one knew. And this is for someone this morning. I would go out for hours, spent hours by myself, out praying, seeking God, trying to get answers, trying to get directive. Didn't matter what my environment was like. I had a wonderful family. At the time I was living by myself, but I had a sister and brother-in-law that were close in the area. I had a wonderful family back home, but nobody knows your personal pain when you are struggling. And the depths of depression, if you're going through that, no one understands depression if you've never experienced it. Seeking, trying to find out whether what you believed, holding on. And the struggle that you go through in that forging time of faith will actually bring you out with a greater strength. And I am stronger today than I was that time. But I went through the press of the pain. And maybe you are in the midst of the clutches of depression or of questioning whether what you even believe is real or not. I met with someone this past week, and they were talking about how they were struggling with what they believed. But if you can remain faithful and not give up the fight in the midst of the pain, you will come out the stronger for it. And you will have a testimony. You can't have, someone once said, a testimony without a test. How many of you would say this morning, I have been through the test? Now, I'm not going to ask how many of you are there right now. But the bread is anything that you have need of in your life. It could be finances. It could be a relationship. It could be faith. It could be a job. It could be anything. And so, in the midst of this, he's going through, and he said in verse 2, then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs which he performed on those which were diseased. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And it goes on, and it talks about how he went through that. And then he took, when the need was there, it said that he took and he broke the loaves. Oftentimes in your life, God cannot multiply what you have need of until he breaks what you have. And what Jesus did was that as they were sitting there, he had them set, and in an orderly fashion because that way they could get a count. And he had them set in groups. And then what he did was this. When he broke it, then he blessed it. You see, because if you try and do anything without the blessing of God in it, it will never become a miracle. If you break bread in your own strength, all that you'll have is broken bread. So he broke it, then he blessed it. He invited God to take what he had and then to do as God wanted to. You see, the real miracle is this. Jesus could have simply spoken, and they could have gone over behind a rock and pulled out all the bread that they needed. But they found a little boy who had 5 loaves and 2 fish. Okay? Now you do the math. Got 15,000 people, give or take a few hundred. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Somehow, it's not going to happen. When you've got more bed than you've got cover, when you've got more month than you've got money, you need a miracle. When you've got 5 loaves and 2 fish and you've got a 15,000 person need, you see, it doesn't matter whether you're... If you have to pay, if you've got a $1,000 payment to make next Tuesday, and all you have is $57.13, it's the same as a person who's got $1,000 and has a $133,000 payment to make. If you don't have it, you don't have it. But Jesus took what the boy had. But wait a minute. You see, the boy had to be willing to surrender what he had. If God's going to do anything in your life, you're going to have to be willing to let go of it. Oh, but that's so hard. That's so scary. But it was not until the boy released the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And then it was not until it was broken. And then it was not until it was blessed. And then they acted on it. Now, wait a minute. Stop and think about this for a moment. When Jesus broke the 5 loaves and 2 fish, what did they have after Jesus broke the 5 loaves and 2 fish? They had 5 loaves and 2 fish. If his disciples would have looked at him and said, that's great, we had 5 whole loaves and 2 whole fish, and now we've got 5 broken loaves and 2 broken fish. Still, same amount of food. It really was. But it was as they acted on what they were told to do. So, got 12 disciples. Each of them take a little bit of a piece. Divides it up. Now you've got 5 loaves and 2 fish spread between 12 people. Picture that. What's the math on that? Not enough. You know? If each of them had, what? A half a loaf, it still wasn't, it wasn't enough. But as they took what they had, and then what they did was they walked to the first group of people, and they started. And he gave them some bread and gave them some fish. And they moved to the next person and gave them some bread and gave them some fish. And moved to the next person and gave them bread and fish. And they kept looking, and they kept giving bread and fish. And they kept going, and bread and fish and bread. Somewhere along the line, they had to get excited. Like, that's where I've been, this is where I'm at, and I still have as much as I started with. What? Now listen to this. So Jesus waited. Did you know Jesus oftentimes was in the waiting mood? It said that he let them finish. Listen to what, I'm going to read some just verses here. Philip, in verse 7, replied, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them. Verse 11, then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterwards, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. We just had a young adults party at our house a couple weeks ago, week and a half, a couple weeks ago. And so we're figuring out how much pizza to order. Every young guy has their own idea of how much pizza they're going to eat. You know, X number of pieces. I don't even ask most of the women. Because if you accommodate the men, there'll be enough left over for the women. And the miracle is we still had pizza left over when it was done. And he said, he gave them as much as they wanted. There's hungry men. In verse 12, listen to this. And after everyone was full, not after everybody had eaten. Have you ever gone in with a barrel appetite and just a plate full of politeness? You know? It's like you're hungry of what you really want, but you're cognizant of what, you don't want to take too much. So you eat daintily. You reserve it on what you eat. You know, I've had people take me out, and I don't order the most expensive thing on the menu. Because you're always considerate of who's paying for it. And I guarantee you, if I'm paying for it or the church is paying for it, I'm not eating the most expensive thing either. But Jesus said, after they were eaten and full. See, God's concerned that the entirety of your need is met. God's not interested in just, well, what was the old hair stuff, dippity-doo? Just a dab will do you. Yeah, come on. Most of the young people think like, God's not interested in just a dab doing you. Now, I'm not here preaching the name it, claim it, blab it, grab it kind of thing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real life living. And Jesus waited till they were full. And after they all had eaten and were full, then Jesus said, we're not going to waste any of this. We don't serve a wasteful God. And listen to what he said. And after everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, now gather the leftovers so there is nothing that is wasted. So they picked up the pieces and they filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten to their full from the 5 barley loaves. They came back and just reiterated again. 12 baskets, but it all came from 5 loaves and 2 fish. What bread do you need today? What is it that is lacking in your life? First of all, whatever you have, God takes what you have. But you have to be willing to give it. And then you have to be willing to let him break it. And then you have to be willing to let him bless it. To invite God's participation in the miracle. And then the last thing that you do is you have to act on it by faith. Those are the principles. Have it, give it, let it be broken, let it be blessed, and do something about it in agreement with what he tells you to do. Act on it. God wants to do so much. Jesus was always taking the natural things. Let me just share with you. One time he needed to pay taxes. He didn't go to the money ATM machine. Where did he make his withdrawal from? From the mouth of a fish. He told one of his disciples, he said, hey, we got to pay this tax. Why don't you go down and grab a fish? A little unlikely. Not your standard norm of doing something. And the disciple went down, and it was the exact amount that was needed to pay the temple tax. Boom. Don't say we have a conventional God. Or how about the time that he was trying to teach Moses? Moses was a great leader. Great leader. A great leader in training. Hadn't gotten there yet. Moses had his own warts. He was an excuse maker. Have you ever been in? No. Have you ever met an excuse maker? Always giving God the reason why it can't be done. Or can't use you. And God will circumvent your circumstances in order to prove to you that he's still able to do it. And so he tells Moses, hey, Moses, what's that you have in your hand? It's a stick. It's a staff. Walking stick. See, again, God takes whatever you have. What's in your hand? What's in your hand this morning? What is the old commercial? What's in your pocket? And then he tells him, throw it down. Again, takes what he has and tells him to do something with it. So you and I, if we have a stick in our hand and we throw it down, what do we expect to see? Stick on the ground. But when he did, it turned into a serpent. That would have not made my wife happy. So then we see, and I'll tell you where the real matter of faith is. Come on. I'm going to be real with you this morning. If God tells me to take my stick and throw it down on the ground, I'll do it. But the real test of faith was he told Moses, now pick it up by its tail. You ever picked a snake up by its tail? That's not where you pick a snake up by. If you're going to pick a snake up and you don't have a long stick, the place that you pick a snake up is right behind its head. But you got to be fast. And but he tells him, reach down and grab it by its tail. Test of faith. And so he does. And guess what happens? Turns back into a stick. Well, let's go on. How about God sent Elijah, had a need. Elijah had a need. And he goes to the woman, or the lady is, and she's got to pay off a debtor. It was the woman that had the need. There's another time that God sent Elijah to another woman that had a need. But she had to pay off a debt. And he said, take your oil. And he said, pour it into a container. And she poured it. Now pour it into the next one. She poured it. Poured it in the next one. She kept filling vessels. Told her to get all the vessels of all the neighbors. Come on. There's a preparation sometimes in our life for a miracle. What are you doing to prepare for God's miracle in your life? Because I'm telling you, it's going to happen. What's the preparation you're doing? And it said that she kept filling containers until she didn't run out of oil. Come on. What did she run out of? She ran out of containers. God's supply was not short. It was her preparation or the availability of things to be filled that ran out. And the moment they ran out of containers, then the oil stopped. What preparation are you making today? And then what about the time that they had the prophets all got together? It was a prophet school or something. And they told them, okay, we're going to go out. Now, the moral to this story is just don't let anybody cook. No, that's not the moral of the story. So they told the prophets to go out. And they go out, and this guy finds some toadstools, mushrooms. And he brought back, but the problem of it was a poisonous mushroom or poisonous toadstool. And they cut it up and they cook it up inside, their stew for the night. And all these prophets come in. And so they're hungry. And the first one takes a bite of this stew. Now get the picture, okay? Probably smells good, got seasoning, got all kinds of, stuff with it, and it's got poison mushrooms in it. And somebody takes a bite of it. And they said, there's death in the pot. Now, what do? How many of you have ever cooked? Okay. Has anyone ever added too much salt to your How do you get rid of salt that you've added too much for? Start over. That's the way you get rid of salt. You can't get rid of salt. I mean, you can stick a potato in there, they tell you, and try and get it all to absorb. But you'd have to have a major-sized potato in order, or as they say back in Indiana, Jared, tater. Yeah. Sometimes you just have to start over. But so you know what they did? The prophet took flour and put in the pot. Now, if I were there, you know what? I would not want to be the taste tester. But it took care of it. A little flour in the pot. Or then what about this? A guy had to they were constructing something. And he borrowed an axe. And have you ever borrowed something? Anybody ever borrowed something? Now, picture yourself of what you borrowed. And he's out there chopping wood, and they're chopping wood close to the river or to a body of water. And he's chopping away, and all of a sudden, the head of the axe comes off of the handle. And it, boop, into the water. And they can't find it. And I don't know the last time you ever put an axe in water, but it don't float. And they're looking around. And so the prophet comes over. Unconventional. And he cuts a stick. Like, what's that going to do? And he takes the stick and he sticks it in the water. And just like ivory soap. No, ivory soap. You know the old saying, ivory soap floats, you know. That the head of the axe floats to the top of the water. And they grab it, and he's able to return it. Unconventional. Or how about, the prophet that went out and was going someplace he shouldn't have been, and God tried to warn him, and his donkey gets too close to, the wall one time and messes his foot up, and the guy, the prophet, just he gets ticked off, and so finally, every time the donkey does something, he beats him. And so finally, the last time, the angel is standing right in the middle of the path, and there is no way to get around this angel. The donkey is smart enough to know not to try. And he just stops. And the prophet gets off and gets ready to beat him. And all of a sudden, the donkey starts talking to the dude. And you know what's even more strange? The prophet starts talking back to the donkey. Unconventional. Or how about this? And this was from Jesus himself. So Jesus, they bring a guy to Jesus that's blind. And so, Jesus doesn't wave his hand, pray over him. Jesus doesn't speak. From God on high, be healed. Jesus spits in the dirt, stirs it around a little bit, makes a good spit mud. And then he takes it and he wipes it on the guy. Now, the blind guy can't see it coming, but everybody around is going like, what? But the blind man can see. Unconventional, but it's God. You see, your lack does not affect God's provision. Your lack of bread, your not having enough of whatever it is, does not quantify or qualify God's ability to meet it. Your inability to do something, your lack of, your insecurities, whatever it is, does not put a limit on God meeting your need. God's taking care of it. And your impossible situation does not nullify God's promise. Let me say that again. Your impossible situation does not nullify God's promise. The Bible says he's watching over his word to make sure that it happens. That's God's thing. This morning, I don't know what you're facing in life. But I want to tell you that if you'll take what you have, and if you will surrender it to God, totally let go of it, can't hold on to it. And if you will give God full control, even to break what it is you've given him, and then you let God bless it. And the last thing, if you will act in faith on what he gives you back, you will see God do a miracle.